Okay, so today we're going to go over what you can do after you've proven that triangles are congruent. And the important thing to remember about congruent triangles is the definition that all of the corresponding parts are congruent. So what we're going to use today is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. So we're going to use this after we've said that two triangles are congruent to then say that two parts that we didn't use to show they're congruent are. We will abbreviate this as CPCTC. So after you've shown that two triangles are congruent, you can say that other parts of that triangle are congruent, and the reason in your proof is going to be CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. And we'll use this in a couple examples today so you can see. Alright, so example 1. Explain how you can use the given information to prove that the triangles are congruent. Now we know angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And again, always mark your picture as you're doing the proof. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. Segment AB is congruent to segment DE. They want us to prove that DC is congruent to AC. Now I'm going to mark that in red. So we don't know that. That's what we want to show. Okay. So the way we would do that is by first showing that triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEC. Okay. Then once we do that, we'll know that segment DC is congruent to segment AC because they are corresponding parts. Okay. So copy the diagram, mark the given information, then add the information that you can deduce. In this case, angle ABC and angle DEC, and if you look at those on the picture, here's angle ABC, here's angle DEC. They are supplementary to congruent angles, so we can say that angle ABC is congruent to angle DEC. Also, angle ACB, this one right here, is congruent to angle DCE. And the reason for that would be vertical angles are congruent. So cleaned up a little bit, we've got these two sides are congruent, these two angles, and these two angles. So looking at our triangles here, we know that two angle pairs and a non-included side are congruent. So by angle, angle, side, we know that the two triangles are congruent. Because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, then we can finally conclude that DC is congruent to AC. Notice, this is our CPCTC that we use after we have said the two triangles are congruent. Alright, example 2, and I'll probably have to go over this one a little bit more in class, but we can use the fact that triangles are congruent to measure things that you couldn't physically go out and measure. So, if we look at the example, if we wanted to know how far apart the two boats are in the picture, segment AB there, that dock's a little skewed. We can't just measure across the water if it's too wide, but we can set up two congruent triangles on the dry land here. Okay, and this is how things got measured before we had stuff like laser rangefinders and all that. I'll give you some better examples in class tomorrow, but let's go over this one right now. So place a marker at D so that AB and BD are perpendicular. Alright, so we've got that distance. Go out here, place a marker at D so that you know you have a right angle there. Find C, the midpoint. Okay, right there. And then locate point E, so go out here perpendicular until A, C, and E all line up. After you've done that, you've just made two congruent triangles, and all you have to do to figure out how far apart A and B are would be to measure DE. They will be congruent. Okay, so let's explain how this works. Because AB and BD are perpendicular, BD and DE are perpendiculars, angle B and angle D are congruent right angles. Because C is the midpoint of BD, we know that segment BC is congruent to segment DC. Okay, and you see they've got that marked. Both of those, the right angles, are congruent there. The vertical angles, angle ACB and angle ECD, are congruent. So let's mark those. So we can say that triangle CBA is congruent to, go ahead and fill that one in, make sure your corresponding parts line up. Okay, so hopefully you said triangle CDE. Okay, and our reason for that is, go ahead and fill that blank in. Which congruence theorem? Alright, so hopefully you guys said angle, side. I'm sorry. Let me fix that. Angle, side, angle is our reason. Okay, so now, because of corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, we know that segment BA is congruent to segment DE. And DE is on dry land. Remember, this is the real world picture. So, if we want to know how far apart the boats are, we can just measure segment DE. In example 2, does it matter how far away from point B you place a marker at point D? Explain. So go ahead and write your answer down and start the video up again when you're done. Okay, it doesn't matter specifically. The only thing that really matters is that when you're listing point C, okay, so we've got point B here, and you travel along to point D, you have to make sure that your midpoint, C, is on dry land, so you can put the marker there, so that when you travel out this way to point E, and you sight along that marker to point A, that you actually can stick that marker in the ground. So that's really the only thing important, is that you go far enough so that C is on dry land. Okay, we are going to skip examples 3 and 4. And instead, I'm just going to have you guys do a couple proofs here. So this picture is similar to one of those. So go ahead and try to prove that PS and QR are congruent. Now, I'll give you a hint. What you want to do first is show that triangle PST and QRT are congruent. So go ahead and try and do this proof really quick. Pause the video, write out the proof, and correct it when you're done. I'll put the given and the proof statements up. So here's your given and proof. Go ahead and write the 2-column proof. Prove that segment PS is congruent to segment QR. Okay, so if we start with our, oops, let me put that back up there. So if we start with our given information, okay, we know that oh, you know what? I kind of messed up, didn't I? Let me move that back up some more. There we go. That fits. One day I'm going to learn how to back this up to correct those so you don't have the mistakes here. But anyways, we are given that segment ST is congruent to segment RT. Alright, that is already marked on the picture. The reason is given. And we are also told that angle SPT is congruent to angle RQT. That is also in the picture. That is also given. So I've got it. That is the same step. So I told you the hint was try and show the two triangles on the outside are congruent. The other thing we know that is congruent is angle PTS is congruent to angle QTR. So if I mark that on the picture right there, the reason for that is the vertical angles congruence theorem. So vertical angles are congruent. Now that gives me enough to say that triangle PTS is congruent to triangle QTR. The reason is angle, angle, side. We have two angles and a non-included side. Now, once I have the two triangles are congruent, then I know the corresponding parts are. And segments PS and QR are corresponding parts. So, now I can say that segment PS is congruent to segment QR, and the reason is corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. Okay, so now it is your turn. Try this one, and again, show the two triangles are congruent. Go ahead and write your proof out, and when you're done, hit play again, and we'll correct this one. Okay, so here are the answers. Let's go through this. So the given information, remember, always mark your picture up. Angle BAC is congruent to angle DAC. Angle DCA is congruent to angle BCA. So there's two angles that are congruent. From the picture, we can get that segment AC is congruent to segment AC. The triangles share a side. That is the reflexive property. So I have enough information now to say that the two triangles are congruent. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle ADC, and our reason is angle side angle. Once I have the two triangles are congruent, then I can show that segment BC is congruent to segment DC because corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. CPCTC. So that's it for today's lesson. We'll practice some of this tomorrow. Key thing to remember on this is that CPCTC, okay, corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, okay, of congruent triangles, is always after you have congruent triangles. Okay, so never use CPCTC to say that two triangles are congruent. Again, you have to know that you have congruent triangles before you use that. So, I will see you in class tomorrow. Have a good night.